Today we're going to be moving in some ways away from ancient Greece and Rome and taking a look at Judaism and Christianity. Basically, we're going to be doing a historical overview of ancient Israel. And in our next lecture, we're going to cover the birth of Christianity in early Christian era. Now, with both of these areas, we're dealing with material where we have a strong written tradition. We also have archaeology that we're going to be able to look at and try to reconstruct somewhat of a picture of that world. But different from when we covered ancient Greece and Rome, we're dealing with an area where the reconstruction often brings up more controversy. And that's really because, unlike Greece and Rome, we still have a very rich and living tradition attached to Judaism and Christianity, right? We're not as divorced from it as, looking at the ancient Greek myths and things like that. So that's going to be a little bit of an issue. How do you actually proceed when we go back and reconstruct the picture that we're trying to attain? So what I want to do is take a look and discuss both the historical reconstruction that we get from scholars and look at a traditional picture, because they're both going to have different things to show us, and they're both going to be really important in different ways. Okay? Now, we want to spend some time developing first the historical picture, or at least the picture that academics come with, because we want to investigate, what is the actual events, what is the truth about what really happened. But you got to remember, whenever we do a reconstruction like that, whether we're talking about ancient Israel or about ancient Greece or any other culture for that matter, when we look at things like archaeology, especially archaeology alone, you're going to have a lot of limits, right? You're not going to be able to ever construct a complete picture. And we've already seen this. And that's especially the case when we don't have a lot of contemporary written text to look at and just, the material remains alone. And we saw this when we dealt with, for instance, Minoan religion, right? We had a lot of artifacts, but we didn't have written records, at least any that we could read. We have Linear A, but they're really indecipherable. And then we have the Mycenaean picture, where we do have the artifacts plus written text that we could read, and we have a better picture that emerges, but still, it's fragmentary. Don't know a lot about Mycenaean religion in spite of what has remained. Luckily, we do have a lot of written text, numerous written texts from various time periods and various people groups that do help us shed some light on the emerging Israel. Of course, they still amount to fragmentary evidence when you really look at it, right? The reality is that even if we did have, let's say, contemporary records in great detail by eyewitnesses, we would still only have a very small window into that world, because it's impossible to have a complete picture, really, of any historical era. Of course, it doesn't follow, though, that we wouldn't have an accurate picture, at least as far as it goes. Another thing that's going to be useful for us is we also do have an oral tradition that was eventually written down. So we could talk about the tradition that has been left behind, which is data, but it's also going to raise other kinds of problems. How does that material fit with the archaeological remains? How do these two pictures fit together? We have the Greek stories on one hand, Age of the Heroes, the stuff from Homer, the stuff that's passed down into Hesiod and later. And then we looked at the archaeology, which gives us a picture of the ancient Bronze Age and the collapse of the Bronze Age, the Sea Peoples, all that kind of stuff. So you end up with maybe a more full picture, but again, often a contradictory picture and more detective work than we would hope, even though it's kind of fun to do the detective work. You could talk even about Greek historians, early Greek historians that talk about things like a Dorian invasion, and compare that to modern attempts to try to find evidence to support such a thing. Of course, if there wasn't the mention in the first place, there probably wouldn't have been anybody looking for a Dorian invasion. So it's not surprising that we haven't found a lot of evidence for it. Even again, when we have sources, even plentiful sources, we often have contradictions in these sources. Again, the Etruscans, just as an example, where do they come from? Herodotus says Asia. Dionysius of Halicarnassus disagrees. When you look at historical figures like Attila the Hun, for instance, when we talk about his death, how did he die? We've got conflicting accounts. Priscus says he died of a nosebleed while he was drunk at a wedding. Marcellinus Comes says he was stabbed to death by his wife. Okay, what do we make of that? Same thing that we're going to do with ancient Israel or Christianity, we do with these other cultures. Now, what I'm going to try to do is give you an overview where we can look a little bit at age picture. And remember, it is an overview, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We want to do a historical reconstruction. That's really where I'm going to start today, with kind of a background picture, looking at some of the archaeological evidence and trying to show you what scholars say may have happened, the sketch that it kind of develops. And again, there are different scholars that have different pictures, so I'm just going to do a very general one. But I also want to take some time to look at the traditional picture, right? The traditional memory of the culture itself. Not only are the stories fascinating, and they may be more familiar to you, by the way, than a lot of the things we looked at with ancient Greece and Rome, because I think more people are familiar with what we get in the Bible than they are with ancient Greek mythology. But the other reason that this is so important, I talked about, these stories from ancient Greece, from ancient Rome, but the reason it's important to do that, especially when it comes to ancient Israel, the biblical tradition, is because the cultural identity that emerges from those stories is the identity that's passed on to the later generations. And it's that perception of history that is going to have the biggest impact on subsequent history and even the present. This is what's going to influence the arts. This is what's going to influence literature. This is going to influence, belief and thought beyond that world. Okay, so it's really important that we do this, and I'm going to, like I said, divide this into two parts. And we're going to start by looking at the ancient Hebrew people and try to first talk about the term Hebrew. I mean, that may be the best place to start. So when we talk about the word Hebrew, we could look at how it was used. For instance, it's used of the early Semitic Israelites. Okay, it's also used of other groups from the Levant, again, which is that region where Israel is going to be located in the Near East. So it's not necessarily specific to the people we think of that show up in the Hebrew Bible, okay? But it is generally today attached to a language. It's a Semitic language. That's what we refer to as Hebrew. In later Greek tradition, Hebraeos is used of the Jews in general, okay? So it could be applied in different ways. The term actually comes from Ivrim, which is the actual Hebrew word for Hebrew. It's a biblical term, and it probably means something like to cross over, and its adjectival form, those from across, or maybe migrants. This might refer back to an early period where you have these peoples, these tribes, migrating, moving, living in mobile communities, right? Tent-dwelling nomads, that kind of existence, which I think is really captured in, for instance, the tradition. There is a memory preserved in the tradition of that. Another term that is interesting, it comes up when we have, again, the advent of modern archaeology. We've seen the term Habiru or Apiru show up in the writings of other peoples. For instance, the ancient Egyptians referred to these Apiru people, and that term seems to mean dusty, or maybe peoples of the desert or something like that. And it was used for a long period of time, basically 18th century to 12th century BC, and it was applied to a lot of different groups, and that's the interesting thing. It's not necessarily referring, when we see it in these texts, to what we might consider the people of the Bible, the Hebrew people, but it could apply to mercenaries, outlaws, laborers, different marginalized peoples. Okay, and didn't seem to have an ethnic significance, which brings up difficulty in figuring out who we're talking about. Okay, but the idea of these nomadic pastoralist tribes is really the idea that emerges. If we're going to take a look at the geography, let's just bring up a few maps and take a look at a region that we can refer to as Canaan. This is where Israel is going to be located when it emerges in the historical scene. The map on the right-hand side is going to give you a picture of the Fertile Crescent, right? You see Mesopotamia coming all the way up the Tigris-Euphrates rivers, and then down along the Levant, basically along what's known as the Jordan River to the Dead Sea, and then you could see it kind of spread over down to the Nile River Valley. So that's the area that's referred to as the Fertile Crescent, and it really was, comparatively speaking, a very fertile region. So when we talk about travel in the ancient world, throughout this particular location, it was not across the desert. It was usually through these areas where you could get to water sources and things like that, which made the area of Canaan, particularly located between the larger and more powerful empires and cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt, kind of a crossroads. All right, so it's going to be very, very important geographical location. On the left-hand side of the screen, you could see kind of a close-up of that region where you see the Dead Sea very prominently located, and a number of the cities and areas of ancient Canaan prior to the period when the Bible at least talks about the arrival of the Hebrew people. This may be what it looked like in an earlier phase. Okay, bring up a different map. Let's take a look at Canaan again right here. If you're looking at the map, the retinue, that word there, you may remember when we talked about way back when the story of Sinui from ancient Egypt, which talks about the character of Sinui who fled from Egypt into that region and then became a prosperous leader and whatnot. Okay, so that's a term that would refer to that same basic region. So Canaan has a number of different terms. I'll probably use Canaan more often than anything else, but again, over time, there are different names that we could use. But I want you to also notice the surrounding cultures. You've got Egypt, you've got Babylon, you've got Assyria, you've got the Hittites up to the north. These are big cultures that we spent some time with in the beginning of the semester looking at. So it's going to be obvious that they're going to have an impact on the emerging culture of ancient Israel. Okay, so do not forget that. And when we look at Israel emerge, here's a map of essentially where it would be located amongst those other territories. So you could see territories that belong to the Philistines along the southern coast. If you move north along the coast, you move into the region where you have the Phoenician city-states. Israel right there on the west side of the Jordan River. Okay, Israel, Judah, we'll look at the different phases of Israel, and the borders shift. Okay, so this is just one particular picture, but you got to realize that this changes over time. Okay, so let's get to some of the material that we have. Let's talk about the question of the emergence of Israel. It's a question of origins, right? Modern scholars are going to debate whether Israel was the result of just tribal migrations into the region from peoples elsewhere, or if Israel actually evolved from a transformation of groups that were already there, kind of an indigenous population that becomes the Israelites. That's one of the questions, I guess, that's on the table. Now, the general agreement among the scholars is that early Israelites subsisted as nomadic pastoralists. Not only do you have this picture in the archaeological record, in the historical record, you also have this as the very picture that emerges in the early phases of the Hebrew tradition. Now, the Hebrew scribes definitely preserved that memory. So that's, I think, something that there's no question about. The question is going to be in regards to how you treat the Bible as a historical source. And this is a debate that will probably never be settled, right? What's the value of the Hebrew Scriptures for actually constructing a picture of ancient Israel, historical picture of ancient Israel? And here's where the wide disagreement comes in. You've got some people on one hand that are going to say almost nothing in that text is historical, and then you get people on the very other end that are going to say, no, everything's historical. Where most scholars fall is going to be somewhere in the middle. Right? You've got a good deal of material that seems to be in the tradition that lines up very well with the archaeological material, and then other passages and sections seem to contradict or disagree with it. Okay. Now, one of the things that you need to know about how we deal with the archaeological record in various texts is a lot of times disagreements emerge based on interpretation of the material that we have. Okay. That just happens to be a pretty common thing you should know about human thought in general. Very often, it's not the facts of an issue that cause debate. It's the interpretation of the facts that cause a debate. Okay, so we're going to take the stuff that we're looking at in the biblical source. We're going to measure that against archaeology. We're going to measure that against other Near Eastern texts to see what kind of picture emerges. And I'm going to do this both when we look at the stuff right here up front and when we get into the tradition. I'll kind of pull in different elements of archaeology that may shed light on some of that tradition. Okay, where there is no doubt is that we're going to be looking at in the Bible the traditional picture, right? The one that has provided the cultural and religious identity that is going to shape the, like I said, future history and perception and the future reality, really, for Jews, Christians, and beyond. Now, the question, of course, is what's going to have the bigger impact, the actual history or the picture that has emerged. And like I said, I think it's often the picture that people have in their mind, the memory that people proceed with, that's going to have the biggest impact on the future. Anyways, let's start with the historical reconstruction, just kind of look at the archaeological ages, starting with the late Bronze Age, maybe 1600 to 1150 or thereabouts, again, very general. We could say that within this time period, we're looking at the 14th century, Egypt had control over the region of Canaan. All right. We have evidence that Jerusalem was already in existence. It was a Canaanite city-state that was under Egyptian control. And you have records or recounting communications from that region in Egypt in the Amarna letters. If you remember back to the period of Akhenaten, Amarna, those were those cuneiform Akkadian texts that were located in Amarna or Akhenaten in Egypt. All right, so that gives us a little bit of a picture. That's one of the reasons these records are so important. They give us insight into things going on within the Egyptian empire, but outside of Egypt proper. Okay, now the Canaanite tribes and cultures form the background for the later emergence of Israel. And what we can see about these cultures is they're clearly polytheistic. That shouldn't be a surprise. They worship gods like El, Asherah, Baal, Shamash, and a lot of other gods. Those are some of the big names. We also know that the Bronze Age is going to collapse by 1150, and it's going to start to collapse beginning probably in the late 13th century. We're going to start to see a breakdown of Canaanite city-states, a destruction of some of these cities, and the question is, where are the Israelites? Is there an Israelite presence at this early stage? Okay. Now, whatever happens, the Canaanite culture that seems to be fragmenting is going to be absorbed into the later Philistine culture, Phoenician culture, and Israelite culture that are going to follow, okay, very clearly. One really important document that dates to this late period, kind of getting close to the actual collapse around 1209 BC, is a stela from Egypt called the Merneptah stela. And this is important because it gives us our first mention of Israel, okay, in an Egyptian document. So it actually says Israel is laid waste and his seed is no more. So apparently there was something of a conflict that resulted in what apparently was the laying waste of Israel, though you always have to take what's mentioned in some of these inscriptions with a grain of salt, because a lot of times, conquerors tend to brag or over-exaggerate the situation, and clearly Israel doesn't disappear at this early stage. It's really just beginning to emerge in the archaeological record. Okay, but the question is, what kind of presence was there in Israel? Right? It does seem to maybe be a cultural identity or political identity, perhaps, but it doesn't seem to be an organized state at this early stage. Okay, as we move past the late Bronze Age into the Iron Age now, 1150 was a transitional period for the most part. In the early Iron Age, we'll call this Iron Age 1, there's a transformation of the Canaanite Philistine cultures. And this is where Israel really starts to emerge. You have differentiation, let's say, between the groups that we're going to refer to as Israelites and other groups within Canaan. There are a few hundred mountaintop, or rather hilltop settlements that are away from declining earlier Canaanite settlements. And you start to see prohibition on marriage, at least this is the picture that scholars reconstruct, prohibition on intermarriage with some of those other groups, dietary restrictions coming in, particularly the ban on pork, the practice of circumcision. Those things seem to emerge, or probably emerged in this phase of development. And you're now going to have the beginning of a religious evolution that's going to take centuries, starting with polytheism, moving through what is a henotheistic stage. If you don't remember henotheism, I'm pretty sure we mentioned it, or monolatry. I know I didn't use that word prior, but this is the idea that there's one God that will be worshipped, but it doesn't necessarily say there was a rejection of other gods as far as like a denial of their existence. It's just maybe a denial of their worship. And then eventually you arise in what's going to be monotheism. So we're going to see this, unfold in the reconstruction that we're doing. Iron Age 2, about 950 to 587, you're going to see a unification. You're going to finally get to a period of monarchy. At one point with a capital at Samaria, very important center in northern Israel. And the henotheism is going to focus on a character or a divinity that is known by the name Yahweh. Okay, seems to be fused with another god, the earlier god El. Okay, and both of those names are actually going to be kind of important when we get to looking at the canon later. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the different names for God that show up in the Hebrew tradition, Yahweh being a really important one, and Elohim being another very important one. Now, where did this God come from? Seems to be an import, scholars believe, from Midian. That's at least one theory. And it may have been the god associated with the monarchy, right, with the leaders of this era, as opposed to maybe what the common people worshipped. So you have, a transitional phase. Other evidence of a monarchy actually comes with what's known as a Teldan stela. This is a document that dates to the 9th century, maybe between early 850s to the late 820s or so. An Aramaic text that actually has a reference to the Beit David, okay, which would be the house of David. This is actually one of the only references we have to the Davidic household or the Davidic monarchy. And if you're familiar at all, again, with the biblical tradition, this is one of the most important characters when it comes to, kings of Israel, but by far the most famous king of early Israel. So the question has always been, how much of the story of David is historical? Was there even a David? Those are the big questions, and here you have at least a reference to that from outside the Bible. Okay, a little bit, maybe 100 years or more after the time when such a figure would have lived, but nonetheless an important archaeological piece. Now, when we get to other texts, outside texts, we could take a look at some of the records left by, say, the Assyrians. And I'll give you a few mentions from the Assyrian records referring back again to the kings of Israel. In 853, Shalmaneser III leaves a record of the Battle of Karkar, where he mentions Ahab the Israelite, a figure that's mentioned prominently in the Book of Kings in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, one of the most notorious kings according to the Hebrew Bible, as a matter of fact. Around 841, the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III mentions Jehu of the people of the land of Omri, another king mentioned in 2 Kings. 830 or thereabouts, you've got what's called the Mesha Stela. This was from the king of Moab, who is recounting his freeing of Moab from what's known as the House of Omri, another reference to a figure in the Hebrew text. So there does seem to be historical personages that are clearly mentioned in the Hebrew books. This also is really important because it's also going to give us the first reference to the name or the word Yahweh from outside, again, the Hebrew scriptures. So that's really important just for that mention alone. By the way, the picture on the left-hand side of the screen, which I didn't point to, shows actually Jehu bowing down to Shalmaneser in the Black Obelisk, which is really a neat, not just a mention, but it's also an image. The next really important document is going to be one left by Sargon II, his record of the destruction of Israel in 722, where he writes, Samaria I captured 27,280 men who dwelt in it I carried away. Now this is a reference to an event that's actually recorded in the book of 2 Kings. And here you've got an event that is mentioned in Assyrian documents and Hebrew documents. They give a different picture of the event, but again, we can at least know that the event took place because we have multiple independent sources for it. At that point, with the destruction of Israel, we would imagine there are a lot of refugees that fled into the southern portion of former Israel, into a region that's going to be known as Judah. And this might be the first stage in the development of a distinct Judaism. Okay, actually, the word Jew comes from the region of Judah and the tribe of Judah. And they would have brought with them these refugees, laws, prophetic tradition of Yahweh, and things like that, which are now going to push the religious development further forward. Sennacherib, another important document, comes from Sennacherib around 689 BC. This is from the Taylor Prism. There's actually several copies of this text. The Taylor Prism is not the only one. You've got the Oriental Institute Prism, the Jerusalem Prism. And I'll go ahead and read this. This is something that refers to an event that we find also in the book of 2 Kings. But it says here, as for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with many smaller towns taken in battle with my battering rams. I took as plunder 200,150 people, both small and great, male and female, along with a great number of animals, including horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. I then constructed a series of fortresses around him, and I did not allow anyone to come out of the city gates. His towns, which I captured, I gave to the kings of Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza. So, another event that is, paralleled in the Hebrew tradition. Again, there are differences, but again, we have a reference to something that kind of helps us line these accounts up, gives us a little bit of a chronology. Okay, now because there are contradictions, it does bring up questions. But we're going to lay those aside. So again, very, very important historical information. the light is starting to get better. As a matter of fact, when we get to the Assyrian and then the Neo-Babylonian period, which follows, you start to get much, much more accurate records and much more accurate dates. Okay, so the scholars have a better chance at reconstructing some of these things. Now, around this time, the scholars will say this is where real biblical monotheism is going to begin to emerge. Late 7th century with the reign of Josiah. Around 640, let's say 622, seems to be the promotion of the worship of Yahweh alone. Okay, again, maybe a movement towards pure monotheism. It's really hard to say from archaeology alone. And then we come to an end of the monarchy in 587. This is at the hands of the Babylonians. You have a deportation of the people of the region of Judah, the end of what's considered the Davidic dynasty, the kings of Judah, and then at this point a reworking of a national identity, right? The national religion and myth begins to take shape in exile. Okay, the Babylonian exile, we'll look at that period a little bit later from the biblical point of view, but afterward, say 520 to about AD 70, a long period of time, about 600 years, we're in what's often referred to as the Second Temple period, where you definitely have a strict monotheism. Circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, all the different symbols of Jewish identity start to really solidify and take shape. You have the development of the synagogues, where Jews are going to continue to worship, read Torah, and teach their traditions. And the Torah itself probably takes shape during this period. At least the idea is the oral traditions are compiled in a long process, and we're going to go into that maybe in a later lecture. I'm not going to cover that here, but we'll talk about that when we get to the canon down the road. And then they're edited, primarily, basically 4th, 3rd, 2nd centuries into the form that is what is passed down today. Okay, so that's the reconstructed picture. And again, it's a very vague picture at that. And again, I'm only giving you a very quick overview of that. But what I want to really turn to now is the Hebrew tradition, the chronology that's laid out in that tradition that we derive really from one source. In that one source happens to be the Bible, so it's really not one source. It's a collection of sources, or collection of books at least. And when we talk about the Bible here, I'm going to be talking about the Hebrew Bible. Now, that's not that it's different from what we find in a Christian Bible, but I'll get into what the distinctions are between the two, again, in a later lecture. But for now, let's take a look at the early phases, or break the chronology down into periods or ages, starting with the age of the patriarchs. When you use the word patriarch, you can see in the Latin word patria in there, the fathers, pater, the word for father, and the word, again, this actually comes from Greek as well, the leaders, the heads. So when we talk about the patriarchs of Israel, the time frame 2166 to about 1660 BC, pretty big window. We're looking at the figures like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the three main patriarchs according to the tradition. And we're going to start with Abram or Abraham, who would have been alive around, let's say, 1900 BC. And the story is that he comes from Sumeria. Right? If you remember, Sumeria collapses around 2000, so this is right at that tail end of Sumerian civilization. He supposedly comes from the city of Ur, which is down south, right, Euphrates region. And the story is that he leaves and departs from Sumer and migrates upward, eventually coming to Haran and then down into Canaan. And the important part about his story is that there's a covenant, okay, a covenant which is a contract between himself and his God. And this is going to be the foundational story that gives us that national identity, this monotheism that's tied to Abraham from the very beginning of the tradition. Now, this period of migration, Abraham was he was nomadic. He lived in tents. He moved around in his life, and he eventually comes to Canaan. Doesn't stay there, actually goes into Egypt for a while. So it's important to kind of look at some things that we have from that time period in ancient Egypt. So for instance, going back to around 1890 BC, Senwosret II, Pharaoh of Egypt at the time, we have records of Western Asiatic foreigners who are visiting Egypt. It might give us a little bit of an insight as to what some of the people from that time period looked like. There's a tomb, a 12th dynasty tomb from an official by the name of Khnumhotep II that depicts a guy who's referred to as a Hyksos, a word that you should already be familiar with, a guy by the name of Abisha. He's right there kind of circling it. This is a relief from that tomb. Abisha is the one with the animal bending forward a little bit. Okay, so this would be an Asiatic, probably a Semitic person in Egypt. Now, the time period we're going to start to talk about this Hyksos migration, developing Canaanite settlement in the northern region of or lower Egypt for the most part, around a territory or city that's going to be known as Avaris. This is going to be a Hyksos capital a little bit later on, but you start to see these movements at this time period. Now, we also have, following Abraham, the other figures that we're just going to kind of mention. I'm not going to talk really much about any of these, but you've got the character of Ishmael. Now, Ishmael, say around 1860, right around this period, the story is that he would be born to Abraham, and Ishmael is going to be the ancestor of the Arab peoples according to Islamic tradition, okay, and even pre-Islamic tradition, because we do find reference to this in late historians or late Roman historians like Josephus, etc. Okay, so then you have Isaac. Isaac would be the younger brother of Ishmael. He's the one that's going to be traced down to the Israelites directly because he has two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is going to be renamed Israel in the story because of his wrestling with God, and it's from Jacob or Israel now that you're going to have the various tribes arise. Now, all of this fits into that second intermediate period of Egyptian history that we looked at, say 1782 or thereabouts to about 1570 BC. And this was a time, remember, when you have foreign rule of Egypt, those Hyksos people ruling from Lower Egypt at Avaris, which we just mentioned. Now, the tribes of Israel are going to be named after these ancestral sons of Jacob. And I'll give you the list of the sons, the 12 sons of Jacob, according to the book of Genesis. All this material, by the way, is in the first book of the Torah. You've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, who's going to be, actually, I'll mention the important ones in a second, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin. Out of that list, you've got the names for the majority of the 12 tribes. There's no tribe of Joseph, but that's a complicated situation that we don't need to get into. But among those names, the tribe of Levi is going to be really important for later Israelites because that's going to be the priestly class, the priestly tribe. Judah is going to be the tribe from which the region of Judah gets its name, and ultimately the word Jew comes from there. And this is where you have the Davidic household, according to tradition, and the capital at Jerusalem. That's all going to be within Judah. And then as far as the narrative goes, the most important of all of these is the figure of Joseph down by the bottom, because according to the story, he was the favorite son of Jacob. And that's going to bring problems. So when we talk about the narrative, what happens to Joseph, if you don't know the story, is his brothers are very jealous of him. They want to kill him, at least most of them do. They decide to do that to get rid of him, but in the end, they relent and decide they're just going to sell him into slavery. So they fake his death, sell him off to some travelers, and he's end up being brought down into Egypt, where he serves as a slave, ends up in prison, and eventually rises to the attention of the pharaoh and to the position of vizier because of his ability to interpret dreams, okay, and because he helps Egypt prosper during a time of famine. He has this really important position, and through his influence, eventually the rest of the family is going to find their way down into Egypt. Okay, so let's say the Egyptians, the Israelites, which is what we can call, this family by this time, will be in Egypt, let's say, by the late 17th century BC. Now, this is the setup for the next really, really important phase of the tradition, which is going to be the period in Egypt and the period of the Exodus, which is coming up. So the sojourn in Egypt, let's say, between 1660 and 1445, and this would have been under the rule of the 15th dynasty Hyksos leaders, right? Those are the rulers of the foreign lands, as the Egyptians refer to them. And again, the capital at Avaris in the north. This is the Delta region. By 1570, these people are driven out by the native Egyptian rulers under Ahmose I, who begins what's called the New Kingdom period in the Empire of Egypt. And it would be at that point that we can imagine that the Hebrew people still remaining in Egypt would have been enslaved, along with tons of other people. As warfare happened in the ancient world, lots of people were enslaved. So this is nothing, particularly unusual about, the Hebrews. So that would have been the backdrop for what's going to be the period of Moses and the Exodus. So let's say 1445 to 1375, we'll talk about the Exodus and the conquest. Now, if you've come across discussions of the Exodus in the past, there's always the question as to when it happened and if it happened. Okay, but if you're going to go with, again, a chronology that's a traditional chronology, you would place it somewhere in the 15th century, though most people today look for evidence of an Exodus without much success, looking in the 13th century. Okay, and there are reasons for that, again, that I don't need to go into, but it has to do with certain place names mentioned in the book of Exodus. Okay, so usually it's associated with the time of Ramesses II, but remember, the text of the Hebrew Scriptures never ever mentions a name for a pharaoh, which is one of the reasons it's so difficult to figure out when to place it. But anyways, according to the traditional chronology, it probably would fall somewhere in the 15th century. So we're just going to give you that as our time frame. The main figure for the Exodus is going to be Moses. And Moses not only is one of the most famous names from the Hebrew Bible, he is by far the most important of the Hebrew prophets. Now, he leads the Hebrews to freedom from Egypt, and for a while they are moving around and they come to a place known as Sinai. Now, the significance of Sinai can't be overstated. According to the tradition, this is where the covenant is set in stone for the most part, and actually literally, according to the story. You have a covenant or a contract with the God, Yahweh. It's going to be the God of the people. They're going to be his people. He'll be their God. This is kind of a two-way agreement, and it's sealed with the law, okay, the Mosaic law, which according to rabbinic tradition has about 613 laws. Okay, there's both a written portion and an oral tradition for the Mosaic law. But I want to look at right now what's called the Decalogue. This is the most famous part about the law. I mean, there's a lot more laws than these 10 commandments that we find in the book of Exodus, but the 10 commandments are the most famous. And here you can see the 2 tablets. Incidentally, it might be important to point out what archaeology does give us when it comes to understanding, these descriptions that we have. So, most people come along and hear about the 2 tablets of the law that are given to Moses by God. And imagine 10 commandments with 5 commandments written on one tablet, 5 commandments written on another tablet, and then he carries these down from the mountains inscribed on the 2 tablets. Now, why are there 2 tablets? Why couldn't you inscribe them all on one tablet? Okay. What we have uncovered, of course, from contracts and covenants between different people groups of the ancient world dating back to this time period, you see these treaties, these contracts written in 2 copies. Very often, one party of a contract is going to have a copy, and the other party in the contract is going to have their copy, and both copies will say the same thing. Same thing we do today, right? When you sign a contract, one party gets a copy and you get a copy. You want to have records on both hands. So most likely the reason for the 2 tablets is that there was God's copy and there was the copy for the people. And of course, God's not going to take a physical copy into his possession. So both copies are brought down by Moses. So it gives a little bit of an insight, understanding that's how contracts were done. There were always 2 copies of these things. So there's 2 tablets. The other thing that's interesting that we get from, again, comparative study of archaeology of the time is the form of the Decalogue is in what's considered a suzerainty treaty. Okay, a suzerain would be an overlord for the most part, and suzerainty treaties are set up in a certain way where you've got a prologue which recounts the deeds that the suzerain has accomplished, followed by obligations of the vassal, the person that is submitting to the overlordship of the suzerain. So they're basically different elements. So for instance, there's 6 elements in a suzerainty treaty. You have the identification of the speaker, the suzerain, a historical prologue, the treaty stipulations, then the provision for placing the text of the treaty, the mention of the gods, and then, because they kind of seal the whole contract for many cultures, not just the Jews or the Hebrews, and then the blessings and cursings that follow for obeying, adhering to, or violating the contract. Okay, so we see this actually in Exodus 20, where it starts off, the 10 Commandments, I am Jehovah your God, you get your identification, who has brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. There, the historical prologue, right, what the suzerain has done, the deeds of the suzerain, and then it says, you shall have no other gods before me. There's the obligations for the vassal. So this really does line up very well with other similar things among the neighbors of the ancient Israelites. The other thing I want to point out about this law code is it's a lex talionis type of system, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I mean, that actually comes right out of the Hebrew law. And we saw a similar code when we talked about Code of Hammurabi, ancient Babylon, okay, which would have been earlier by a couple centuries. Now, when we looked at Hammurabi's code, the lex talionis was an advance over, the idea of not having a written code at all, but the idea of, again, eye for an eye is to kind of restrict penalties and to stop abuse of power and things like that, to set up a proportional system of retribution. Now, Hammurabi's code had your moral, social legislation separate really from religious legislation. And in the Hebrew code, you don't have that clear distinction, right? There's no real distinction between secular and religious. That's important. This is all religious law for the Jews, for the Hebrew people. There are moral, there are social, there are dietary laws, purity laws, all that kind of stuff. Especially the dietary purity laws are really about cultural distinction, to distinguish the Hebrew peoples from other peoples around there. Okay, so you don't want to assume that all laws were moral in nature. Like laws of morality, such as murder and things like that, theft. Those are more universal moral standards. But the other laws, diet, purity laws, those are particular to the culture, because what was very strict in the tradition is that these people are not supposed to intermarry and become contaminated with the pagans around them, the polytheistic cultures that they were literally surrounded with. Okay, so that's one of the reasons that this law is so important in the tradition. The other thing that's really important about this law code is, and it's a distinction from the Hammurabi law code, is there's no distinction by class. Hammurabi's law code, if you remember, has different penalties for upper class versus the lower class, for upper class versus the slaves, free versus slave. Very serious differences, whereas in the Hebrew tradition, there are no class distinctions that are made. Everybody is ultimately equal under the law, and that's a big step forward when it comes to law. Okay, some other things that are important that takes place at Sinai is you've got reference to the tabernacle. This is going to be essentially the center of Israel, both religiously and actually physically, when it comes to this wandering period. The story in the book in the Torah is that the tribes of Israel actually literally camp around this mobile shrine. Okay, so literally it was the physical center of their nomadic wanderings, but more importantly, it was the religious center for these people. Okay, and not just during the 40 years in the wilderness, it's going to be the center of the focus. This is what housed the Ark of the Covenant, and that's the thing that actually functions like the throne of God for the most part, the presence of God dwelling among his people. And in the bottom picture, you can see the very famous scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones obtains this wonderful golden box, which inside should contain the 10 Commandments as well as a few other things. Okay, so that was what's located here in the tabernacle. The tabernacle will eventually be replaced. We'll get to that in a little while. But for the most part right now, that's the center of the community. Anyways, let's say 406 or thereabouts, Moses passes away at Mount Nebo, never arriving into Canaan, what's called the Promised Land or the Holy Land. That is going to be something that's accomplished by Joshua, who succeeds to the leadership of the Hebrew people. He crosses over the Jordan with the tribes behind him into Canaan, and then that's a period of the conquest. And you have the famous stories of things like the destruction of Jericho, the destruction of Ai, various other cities, and then the settlement of the 12 tribes within the region. Ultimately, Joshua will die, let's say around 1375, bringing this era to a close. Okay, so at this point, we're going to start to talk about a group settled now in the land, but yet without a clear, organized government. Okay, the period of the judges is what follows, 1375 to about 1050, according to tradition. And like I said, it's a pre-monarchic. You have judges, and what we even mean by a judge is a little bit confusing. Let me back up. I think I went past that a little too quickly. Again, no king, The judges we could think of as kind of military, religious leaders over different tribes. Sometimes there may be more than one judge at a time. Again, not clear from the book of Judges exactly what judges are, but there are a lot of famous names from among the 16 judges that are mentioned, such as Gideon, who fought the Midianites. You've got Samson, probably the most famous of the judges, like the Hebrew version of Hercules. His conflict with the Philistines, very important. And then Samuel, who's kind of the last prophet/judge, who is the transitional figure into the period of monarchy. The tabernacle still there, residing at a place known as Shiloh for about 300 years during this time period. And it's also the period where you can see from the illustration here, these are Philistines, or at least the sea peoples as recorded by Ramesses III. But the Philistines really start to arrive in at least higher numbers during this period. Reflecting that period of the Sea Peoples. Remember, the Sea Peoples tried to get into Egypt, were repelled, and the Peliset, who most people think are the Philistines, arrive in the region of Canaan. That's going to become the big enemy of the early Israelites in the land. And if you think about it, the early Israelite nomads are now going to be dealing with the much more advanced Philistines, because the Philistines, if you recall, are most likely Mycenaean Greek peoples. Okay, so culturally speaking, they would have better weapons, probably a little bit more advanced culturally, and they're going to become a nuisance at least for a short period of time, especially as we get into a period of monarchy. All right, so from 1050 to about 930, this is the period of the United Monarchy, and the first king, according to tradition, is a guy by the name of Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. He is anointed king by Samuel, and he's a man of war. Okay, and the story is that he's not really the best of kings. He's a great warrior, but ultimately is a moral failure. Ends up being defeated by the Philistines in battle, commits suicide at Mount Gilboa, and then the throne passes on in a very confusing way to two men, kind of simultaneously. Most people think David immediately, second king of Israel, but it actually was a period of very brief fragmentation. You've got Saul's son Ishbosheth become the second king over what's known as Israel in the north, and then David, who was one of the big generals under Saul, becoming king of Judah to the south. But that's for a very, very brief couple years. After the death of Ishbosheth, David reunites all of Israel, so he is really considered the second king of a united kingdom. And like I said before, is the most famous of all kings in the tradition. Now, what happens during his reign, according to tradition, is not necessarily just perfect rule. Even though he's one of the most famous kings, he has all kinds of problems. You do have an expansion of the kingdom under David, but you have, especially amongst the Philistines, a lot of war with the Philistines that ultimately is going to break the Philistines as a major threat. But you also have internal problems, civil war, rebellion. Even David's own son Absalom rises up against him. So it's a period of turmoil, yet some bit of prosperity. And then after David, oh, by the way, the other thing that's really important is he's credited with the conquest of Jerusalem, which is ultimately going to be his new capital. Right? Jerusalem already existed. We already saw way back when, but now it's finally taken as a major city for the Hebrew people in the land. After the death of David, he moved to his son, which is Solomon. The next really famous kings, let's say 970 BC, third king of Israel, known for his great wisdom, and it's at the period of Solomon's reign that we have the development of the city of Jerusalem and the development of other cities in Israel. And this is really backed up by archaeology, construction projects that are undertaken. The temple, for instance, is built in Jerusalem, which replaces the tabernacle. You now have a permanent center of worship for the people on the Temple Mount. Okay, the tent is gone, the ark is moved inside, and you also have very close relations with people around Israel, particularly the Phoenicians. Matter of fact, even in the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, the tradition acknowledges that there are a lot of Phoenician laborers and architects that were employed in the building of this really well done and expensive ornate temple. Okay. So he's the last king, though, of a united kingdom. What happens after the death of Solomon is everything fragments. So from 930 to 722, we could talk about there being in existence two kingdoms. Now Solomon's son, Rehoboam, succeeds as the king of Israel, and there were rebellions under his reign, basically because of oppressive tax burden on the people. That's what the story gives us. And the rebel Jeroboam, who had previously been a revolutionary against Solomon, had been in exile, returns to Israel and raises up a number of tribes against Rehoboam, and it results in a breaking into two kingdoms. The two kingdoms are going to be Israel in the north, which is going to last from the period of, let's say, 930 to 722. So Jeroboam is going to become the first king of this broken Israel. It includes 10 tribes, and it's going to ultimately have its capital at the place known as Samaria. Now, within this time period, there are 9 different dynasties and about 20 different kings that rule Israel. The southern portion of former United Israel is going to be known as Judah, and that's going to last from 930 to 586, so it's going to be a little bit longer. Rehoboam remains king over that, and there are really 2 main tribes, Judah and Benjamin, that make up Judah. Judah, of course, being the dominant one, which is why it's named after Judah. And the capital is going to remain at Jerusalem. So it's not only going to be, a capital city, but it's also going to be the religious center. Now, there's only one dynasty in Judah. This is the Davidic house. Okay? And you have, again, about 19, 20 different rulers in this time period. That alone, 9 dynasties versus one dynasty, kind of tells you that Israel's a little less stable and Judah's a little bit more stable. Okay, so the relationship between the two is going to be kind of an off and on, friendship, adversary relationship. But what emerges in the text of the tradition is that you've got paganism start to increase, starting with, really 9th century. Various figures are going to be associated with the decline of monarchy in Israel, particularly, such as King Ahab, one of the most notorious kings according to the tradition, who marries the very famous woman Jezebel, right there in her name, Bel. That refers to the god of her people, the god Baal. Okay, and she's the daughter of a Tyrian king by the name of Ithobal. Okay, now she's going to, of course, kind of bring her religion into Israel. You have relationships also with Judah. King Jehoshaphat, for instance, has an alliance with Jezebel. Her daughter and his son get married, Jehoram. She ultimately, the daughter, becomes queen of Judah. So you've got, this idea of foreign rule, foreign influence within Israel. And according to the tradition, this leads to God becoming displeased with his people. And it's also ultimately going to result in the destruction of Israel first, right? In the 8th century, the Assyrians are going to conquer Canaan. They're going to conquer Israel. 725, Hosea, king of Israel, resists the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, and Shalmaneser lays siege to the capital of Samaria. Now, the siege wraps up several years later, 722, under his successor, Sargon II, who then deports the 10 tribes of the north. This is the end of Israel, and what we refer to now as the 10 lost tribes. You may have heard that phrase before. This is when that takes place. Okay? So Israel is no more at 722. The only thing that remains is Judah, which is going to last until the Babylonians come in 586. So what happens with the remaining kingdom? 7th century, Assyria is eventually going to be defeated by the Babylonians, the Medes, the Scythians. We talked about this. 612, the destruction of the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. What follows, a number of things. 609, the Battle of Megiddo. There's like a power vacuum. After the Assyrians are broken, you have, at least for a little while, the Assyrian army still on the field, but you also have the Egyptians, you have the Babylonians, and the region of Canaan or Judah is going to be contested. At the time, it looks like the Egyptians are going to step into that power vacuum, and Pharaoh Necho II comes up and at the Battle of Megiddo actually kills the king of Judah, Josiah. All right, and Judah becomes a vassal state to Egypt at that time, and Jehoiakim is installed by Egypt as the king of Judah. By 605, it looks like things are shifting in the direction of ancient Babylonia. The Battle of Carchemish, you see Nebuchadnezzar defeat the Pharaoh Necho, and ultimately attack Judah, take Judah as a vassal state, and take away hostages back to Babylon. In 605, the idea of taking hostages, again, to keep people loyal. This is not a major deportation or anything like that, but you do have some of the noble families have their children taken back by Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon. Okay, Jehoiakim, definitely now subject to a different power, Mesopotamian power of Babylon. By 601, there's a rebellion. Jehoiakim revolts against Babylon, kind of, putting his hope in Egypt. Ultimately, this is going to fail. By 598, Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem. You have Jehoiakim actually die before the city is taken, but in 597, Nebuchadnezzar, who has then completed his siege, starts to deport portions of the population. This, the beginning was called the Great Deportation, but it's not the destruction yet of Jerusalem or of Judah. That's going to follow not long after. By 589, Zedekiah, who is placed on the throne, I forgot to mention, Jehoiakim, after he dies, his son Jehoiachin becomes king, and when Nebuchadnezzar starts to deport the population, he actually brings Jehoiachin with him into exile and places his uncle Zedekiah on the throne. Zedekiah is going to be the last king of Judah. Makes another alliance with Egypt. 589, doesn't stay loyal to Nebuchadnezzar, but now Nebuchadnezzar comes back with the full might of Babylon, lays siege again to Jerusalem, destroys the city, destroys Solomon's temple, and leads the people off into the great captivity. And it seems like it was the entire population. It wasn't. It was a portion of the population. Let's say maybe 20% maximum of the population go back to Babylon. Okay, Zedekiah among them. Now, this is the beginning of what's called the Babylonian captivity, the Babylonian exile, which is a very short period. 586 to 539, the people have been led off. This is, again, mainly the tribe of the Judeans, okay, or Judah. So we could start to talk about Jews at this period. The major prophets that you have are Jeremiah, Ezekiel, give us some insight into that period, those books. It's a beginning also of a diaspora, which is a dispersal of Jewish people elsewhere. As you would imagine, lots of these people are now outside of Judah. Like I said, 20 to 25% of the population has been deported. And most people look at this as really a developing religious identity during this period as well. Again, especially modern scholars. You see the Torah redacted, according to the scholars. You see the emergence, really, of rabbinic Judaism, this idea of the teaching rabbis that are going to be the foundation of what we think of as Judaism going forward. The synagogues develop. There's an ethno-religious identity. Again, we're going to start to use the term Jews of these people. But it comes to an end, the captivity, by 539 BC, when the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon and liberates the Jews. Okay, so here you see the Cyrus inscription that's from Cyrus's capital at Pasargadae. So Cyrus is going to be viewed by the Hebrew tradition as somewhat of a savior figure. He's actually referred to as a Messiah in the Hebrew tradition because of his liberation of the Jews. Now, we're in the period of the Restoration, 538 to 433. The Cyrus decree supposedly is issued, which allows the Jews to go home. And some of the early returning people are going to be led by Zerubbabel. Okay, he's one of the first to bring a portion of these exiles back home to Judah. The decree is based on, or actually here's what's called the Cyrus Cylinder, which indicates Cyrus's idea of liberating various people groups. It doesn't actually mention the Jews in particular in this inscription, but it does help us understand a little bit what was going on. So Cyrus, again, fairly enlightened ruler who allowed a lot of local autonomy even within the greater Persian Empire. Now, at this time, the people that did go back to Judah, not very many. You can imagine several decades in captivity. Most of the people that had been in captivity are now born in Babylon. They were used to Babylon. They liked the civilization of Babylon, which is much more developed. You go back to Judah, you can imagine you're going to be starting from scratch. It's a different land. This is not where you grew up, so it would be strange. So you got some people that definitely wanted to go back to their homeland, this idea of a promised land. Other people didn't. The vast majority did not go back. As soon as the Jews arrive back home, you do have a reconstruction of the temple, right? You've had a period now without a temple, but you have to have a temple to basically be the center of your religion once again. So 520 to 516, you have a construction of a rather poor second temple, and it's dedicated by 516, and the temple sacrifice starts up again, etc. Then you have the other returns which follow. Say in the 5th century, middle of the 5th century, you've got returns by Ezra and later by Nehemiah. There's some debate as to who came first, but both of these guys seem to lead people back to Judah. And around the time of Nehemiah, you have walls built back around Jerusalem. And it's at this period that we eventually get to the close of what we'll call the Hebrew canon. And what I mean by that is the stories encapsulated within the Hebrew Bible, with the exception of what we might call apocryphal material, and we'll get to that later, basically end with this time period, okay? What follows is what's going to be called the intertestamental period, and here we're moving into Christian terminology. So I want to again clarify the Hebrew Bible. I've tried to reserve that reference so far when we talked about ancient Israel, because it was a Christian designation to talk about this material as what's called the Old Testament. Right? The Jews don't have an Old Testament because they don't have a New Testament. The New Testament is uniquely Christian. So when we talk about an intertestamental period, we're talking about the period between these two collections of books, the Old and New Testaments. Now, it's not a period that is not important. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of history in the intertestamental period. It's just not included in the core canonical books. Okay, so from 432 to about 4 BC, let's just recap the highlights of the intertestamental period. And a lot of this, again, is review, because we've seen all this stuff before. 332, right, Alexander the Great. We're going to be looking basically now at the region of Judah and kind of the changing hands as far as its politics go. Alexander conquers the region. Jerusalem submits around 332 BC. After the death of Alexander, remember, Ptolemy in Egypt is going to come up, take the region of Palestine, and Jerusalem becomes part of the Egyptian Empire. And it's going to have pretty good rule. The Egyptians were, at least the Ptolemies, pretty good rulers over the region. And around 250, we already said that with the advent of Hellenism, the people, especially Jews outside of Judah, would have been really used to the Greek language, which basically replaced their native Hebrew, and you start to need translations of their Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language. So you have the Septuagint under the oversight of Ptolemy II, kind of sponsored the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek at that time. That's the Septuagint. We'll talk about that down the road. That would have been around 250. And then when we get to the Seleucids, Antiochus III, around 198, this is after the Fifth Syrian War, takes control of the region, right? The Syrians or the Seleucids were fighting numerous wars over this territory with the Ptolemies in Egypt. Antiochus III actually succeeds in taking the territory. Now, his successor, a guy by the name of Antiochus IV, notorious figure in Jewish tradition, known as Antiochus IV Epiphanes, attempts to Hellenize the Jews. And this was incredibly offensive to at least many of the Jews. Right? What he does, according to tradition, is he sets up an altar to Zeus in the temple, on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is incredibly offensive, and sacrifices pigs and stuff. Again, an animal that would be considered incredibly unclean to the Hebrew God, right there on the most sacred spot for all of Judaism. This leads to a revolt. It's going to be known as the Maccabean Revolt. Some of the priests refused. Mattathias Maccabeus, for instance, refused to sacrifice. And then there is this independence movement. And the Maccabean Revolt actually very quickly results in the freedom of Judah, or independence of Judah from the Seleucids. Of course, the war drags on for a couple decades, from about 167 to 142, and the majority of the war was actually fought amongst the Jews themselves. Those Jews that favored Hellenism versus those purist Jews that wanted to reject, all the Greek material. So that was a big struggle in the Maccabean Revolt. By the time we get, and by the way, you also have the establishment of a new dynasty in Judah, known as the Hasmonean dynasty. This is going to be a dynasty that's going to last for about 100 years, from 166 to 63 BC. And at 63 BC, we have the arrival of the Romans under Pompey. Right? He conquers the region. Jerusalem now belongs to them, at least briefly. In 54, the story is that Crassus, one of the triumvirs, an ally of Pompey's, comes through on his way to fight with the Parthians. Apparently goes into the temple, plunders the temple in Jerusalem. And the later Jews and Christians even view this as the reason for Crassus's ultimately his defeat by the Parthians and his betrayal and murder. Okay, kind of divine judgment on Crassus's behavior. Anyways, the Parthians end up taking the territory briefly from the Romans for a period of about 3 years, from 40 to 37. And while Parthia controlled Jerusalem, back in Rome, you've got the coronation of a king by the name of Herod. The Romans declare him king of Judea and then install him on the throne in 37. This is the famous Herod the Great. The Romans help him retake Jerusalem, put him in charge as kind of a puppet king, all right, a subject of Rome, and a man that is generally known as a fairly notorious figure. And here's where we start to transition into the New Testament period, because Herod is a character who does show up in the stories of the early life of Jesus. Okay, we know that around 19 BC he begins to renovate the temple. Okay, the Herodian phase of the temple is often viewed as the third phase of the temple. It's really a reconstruction renovation on a much grander scale of the entire Temple Mount, something we can look at. I think that's going to be a presentation topic for you guys in one of the groups. And then by 4 BC, we have the death of Herod. That's going to conclude the intertestamental period, because when we pick up the story again next time, we're going to be looking at the life of Jesus and the birth of Christianity in the 1st century AD. And like I said, Herod is king when Jesus is born, so that's really the appropriate point to stop. I know that's a lot of material, and again, a very cursory examination of a very complex topic, but I want to get you at least a picture of the ancient people of Israel, the beginning of Judaism, and what we're going to cover next time is going to be the advent of Christianity and its splintering off from Judaism. So we'll take a look at that next time, and for now, that is it for ancient Israel.